Hello, everyone. We are so excited that Dr. Jayne Brandel will be presenting today on the Salad Lab, which will be a very useful tool for you as you do your comprehensive assessments. Dr. Brandel is the chair at the Communication Sciences and Disorders program at West Virginia University, and she has helped us so much in understanding language and has done several presentations for the department, and we are very grateful. So Dr. Brandel, thank you so much for presenting, and I will watch the chat box to see if there are any questions, but I'll try not to interrupt until the end.
Well, ask the questions as they come up, because that will help with the flow. Okay, and I'd much rather talk about the questions that they have, just because then it'll be more meaningful. But I did kind of put this together. We've been getting a lot more samples this year, which is exciting. And I reached out to Leanne and just said, you know, maybe it would be helpful if we just did a quick little refresher, because depending on where you went to school, when you went to school, you may have had more or less information shared with you on language, and specifically on how to do language sampling. But with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So kind of some of my goals for today, I want to give you some tips on eliciting that will help it to be more productive and get you information that shows the breadth of the skills that your students have. I want to talk about different modifications that are appropriate, and kind of vicariously talk about things that we want to avoid and why. And then briefly, we'll go over the output that you will be getting, and how you might be able to use that to relate to writing academically related goals. So that's kind of my particular goals. That being said, if you have questions about this, or even anything about the new evaluation process, I'm happy to do my best to answer those questions. And if I can't answer it right then, I will get the information to Leanne so that she can share it with all of you. So goal number one, let's talk about elicitation, because this is really kind of that key piece to making sure that we have good data. And if we don't get the best elicitation tasks, or we elicit in the wrong way, our data is not going to be reflective of the capabilities of our students, then we're likely to write a bad goal, and things just continue to go south from there. So it really is critical. The great thing about doing language sampling or communication samples is that if you utilize them as the context for your goal and for monitoring progress, you're pretty much guaranteed that what you do is going to be functional, because unlike when you may use tasks, although hopefully you're not, because it's not what standardized tests are meant to do. You're not supposed to write goals off of them. But really, if you do that, you kind of narrow things too much, oftentimes. Plus, it's also very difficult to show progress, because those are meant to be a very gross measure of language, and not meant to be something that is utilized for writing a specific goal with a specific target behavior. So the beauty of doing the communication sample is in the evaluation is you already have your data for writing your goal then. So my first tip, and I'm going to show you where you can go to do this once we get through all of these tips and everything, is that if you want to have standardized data that is then compared to same age peers, you need to follow a protocol. So some of us were misled in graduate school, and I was one of those people, that we could just go out and make up our own task when we went to do a language sample. The reality of that is that you shouldn't do that, because what you do, how you say what you say, impacts the type of response that you get from your client. And so if I do one type of an interaction and 5 other SLPs do a different type of an interaction, we can't compare MLUs across those samples because we did different things. And so you're not going to know if what you're getting is normal or not normal in that particular case, because it could be an effect of what I did in my activity. So it's really important that we use some kind of a standardized protocol, and those protocols can be very stringent or they may be less stringent, but either way, you should probably use something that is similar to that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Like I said, we really need to have those protocols be standardized so that we can compare, especially, and I keep emphasizing this, especially if you're wanting it for identification of students with a language disorder and not just monitoring progress over time. So consistency is a really, really important piece of this. And specific to conversational samples, the narrative samples are a little bit simpler because most of them are narrative retells at this point, although protocols are always expanding, and as we get access to those will get shared with you. But the conversational samples are probably the most sensitive to SLP error. Because if you think about the way that conversations are structured, the type of response that I get from my communication partner is dependent on my prompt that I give them. So if I ask them, what did you do at school today? I'm likely to get a 1, maybe 2-word answer to that. But if I ask them to tell me about the activities they did in math, because that's a more open-ended prompt, I'm more likely to get full sentences and at least phrases. So paying attention to the types of prompts that you give during your conversational samples, if you choose to do those, is really important. And so this is something we really want to pay attention to, because you end up impacting the data really, really significantly, and in particular MLU. As well as number of different words and total number of words, which are probably 3 of the biggest measures that we as SLPs most commonly use. So when we go to think about these conversational samples, using a protocol can help you to do those open-ended questions. I also have noticed, I've been helping the students out in the lab and doing a lot of transcribing myself to try and help get them caught up. One of the other things that can be helpful in getting students to share more information about something is also sharing information about yourself, because then it becomes less like an interview, and kids tend to shut down in interviews, let's be honest. If any of you have kids, if you're sitting around the dinner table and you start asking them drilling questions, they start giving you less and less. If you start sharing information about yourself, you're more likely to turn it into a back and forth and a sharing, and then you can slowly pull yourself out of that so that you're getting more from them and less from you, because that's always the goal. You get to your 50 utterances a lot faster if you're not having to talk as much. But you want those 50 utterances to be quality utterances. So a lot of times, in the conversational protocol, one of the things you can talk about is the most recent holiday that they may have celebrated. So rather than saying, what did you do for Christmas? You might say something like, we opened Christmas presents on Christmas morning. Tell me about when you opened your presents. And then really going in a back and forth manner versus just as soon as they stop talking, moving on to the next prompt or question or probe. It feels more natural. The students are more likely to open up. So just something to consider when you go to do those conversational samples that's important. Related to that, this may be a skill that you weren't taught to do in graduate school. Although language sampling has been around since the 1970s, it was recommended as early as the 1990s by ASHA. And best practice specifically said in the late 1990s, about 1999 or 97, I believe it was, that they recommended that evaluations include language sampling. But if you weren't trained to do it, it's really important that you go back and listen to your language sample. And there's kind of I don't have the fidelity forms yet ready to go, but I'm going to upload them to the website when I do. But it's just a checklist of things that as you're going back and listening to your elicitation, it's a way for you to kind of focus on yourself and see how you're doing so that you can continue to improve this skill. The more comfortable and confident you feel in it, it'll also become faster and easier. I mean, I remember when I was in practice, I had the PLS. I could give that thing with my eyes blinded and everything else, under tables, over tables, whatever, wherever the kid happened to be, I could do the PLS and I had it memorized. What I'm hoping is as you get more familiar and comfortable with communication sampling and these protocols and things, that too will start to feel that comfortable as well. But it's important that we be doing it correctly. And so following those protocols, going back and listening and paying attention to how closely you follow the protocol. You know, if you're doing a conversational sample, one of the things I do with my grad students when I'm training them is they get to go back and tally how many closed-ended questions they asked. And then their goal is to get that down to 1 or 2 in a language sample. And then they've successfully achieved a level of mastery on that particular skill. So these are things that you can do to kind of set your own personal professional goals as you develop the skill. And again, depending on your training, many of us came from very different graduate programs. Graduate programs are as diverse as an individual themselves. So you can kind of reflect on how much you were trained to do this over time. One of the other things that I would encourage you to do is pay attention to the environment where you're recording. It really impacts your ability to listen and transcribe the sample if you're in a noisy place. And, you know, sometimes those things are outside of our control, right? If you're in an older school, you may have radiators. Radiators aren't known for being quiet when they're kicking on. And you only have so much control over that. But if you can time it or somehow place things in a place where it's a little bit less impactful on the recording, I know it makes it easier on us. But there are other things as well. Moving the microphone in the middle of a sample is pretty much going to guarantee that that section is not able to be transcribed. Because it just shifts everything around so much that you can't understand anything that anyone's saying. So paying attention, and again, that's where going back and listening to your recording can be helpful for you to identify things that may be happening in your particular classroom or room environment, hallway. If you're like me, you didn't have a room. And so those are things to kind of pay attention to as well. One of the big things that I'm noticing is a lot of our files are coming in a format that is not compatible with our software system. So if you go to your automatic settings on whatever device that you're going to use, whether it's an iPad or a digital recorder, if you can make sure that it's set to an MP3, or I think it's called a WMV, even an MP4, but we're getting a lot that are actually video files. We can't transcribe video files. And so we're having to go in and change the format of those recordings. It just slows our process down a little bit because now we have to do an extra step in the transcription process, whereas if they came to us as MP3 files, it would be much faster. So any questions about elicitation before I move on to the next part?
I do have a question. Is there any indication in the system anywhere that lets you know an incompatible format was not accepted or uploaded?
So we have just worked with the things that we have. So if you submitted an M4A or whatever, we use it. We I call it ripping. We rip it into an MP4 and then we download it and transcribe it. So we've been able to do that and fix it. It's just like I said, it does slow us down because we're having to add that extra step in.
Well, related to that, Rhea asked, on that same train of thought, is there any sample confirmation notice that we could use to know for certain our sample was received?
At this time, no. And we originally tried to do that, but again, it was pulling people off of transcribing, and given the number of samples that we were receiving, it seemed like not a good use of our time to do that. Now, that being said, I have additional help this semester, so we'll see if we're able to do that. But at this point, given the influx of files that we're having, taking that time is just not something that we do. And we don't have a system in place that allows for an automatic process.
Another question is, what is everyone recording the sample on? So this is from Shayla. So perhaps you guys can put in the chat box what everyone is using to record the sample on.
And while they do that, I'm just going to add to that a little bit because I forgot, and that was some of the questions that were asked in that form that you gave me, Libby. Things that you may need to find out that are relevant to your county is whether or not you can use a personal device or need to use a school device. I know at the university we have to use devices that can be locked, which means we have to have a special code that only certain people have access to. For HIPAA, and you guys are going to have similar types of requirements possibly due to FERPA. So I would make sure that you're kind of communicating with your special education director or your lead SLP to find out what your district requires as far as the device that can be used in order to do that.
So what they're putting on here is voice memo on their iPads and also voice memos on their iPhones.
Yeah. That would have been my guess. There are little digital recorders that you can get that are pretty cheap, that do just fine, and they plug into a computer like a USB drive, so that you can download right onto your computer and then send it to us if you needed to, or save it to their student file. Okay. Are there any other questions, Libby?
Somebody just said she uses voice memo on MacBook, but it does always save as an M4A file. I'm not sure how to change it.
Go into the settings and adjust that.
She said she wasn't sure how to do that. So does anybody else have that issue? It should be in your settings, right?
Yeah, I would think it'd be your settings. You should be able to Google, and there should be instructions on how to go into that program and make that change. If I didn't have Google, I wouldn't be able to do most of what I do on my computer.
I agree. All right. Well, Michelle, if you don't get that answer, try to reach out to some of the other folks, or to Leanne or myself, and we'll try to find that answer for you.
Yeah, I actually have a MacBook, so I can look at that and see. Libby, what was that program she uses again?
She said she uses voice memo on her MacBook.
Okay.
But it always saves it as an M4A file.
Yeah, I'll look at mine and see what the steps are for doing that, and I'll get that to somebody.
Okay, that would be good.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about modifications, because sometimes we're asking our students to do things that they're not familiar with, and so we may need to make modifications to the task. Sometimes those modifications aren't a big deal, and then sometimes they are. So I'm going to kind of talk about that, because as this slide kind of indicates, depending on what we do, it may help or it may actually make our data bad. And so, or just incompatible with what we're trying to do with our database. So we have to kind of pay attention to that, and what we're doing to make sure that we're not creating a situation where it's not going to allow there to be good data. So with your conversations and your play-based samples, One of the things that you want to remember, like I mentioned earlier, is open-ended questions. Another thing that I notice in students, and actually I notice in myself at times, is that I will do what I call the barrage of questions, which means that I'll ask a question followed by about 2 or 3 more questions. And unless they're Superman or Superwoman, there's no way they could have responded in the amount of time that I gave them to answer any of those questions. And so that ends up impacting the quality of the sample. So really paying attention to whether or not you're asking one prompt or question at a time and then waiting 7 seconds. We need to remember these are clients that clearly are having difficulty with speech or language. They may have an intellectual disability. We need to give them processing time and time to think about what they want to say and how they want to say it. So making sure that you ask a question and then wait 7 to 10 seconds after that question before you move on to another prompt. Or I would actually recommend that when you ask a question and they give you no response at all, that may be an opportunity for you to share something about yourself and then pause and wait and see if they will then feel comfortable to share something about themselves. So if you did the prompt about, tell me about what you did over Christmas break, and I wait, then I might then add, I went and my daughter came to visit from North Carolina. And so then I can just kind of talk maybe 1 or 2 sentences about that and then wait again and see if then they start talking about visiting family or friends or that type of thing. So again, this is where kind of thinking about how you're going about that interaction, slowing it down can be really important. Related to that, talking at a slow pace. So again, you'll notice a lot of what I'm talking about is slowing down. Taking a deep breath and just kind of moving at a pace that encourages thoughts, encourages them to participate, and isn't intimidating. And then again, I've kind of mentioned this before, but you can make comments too. That's not going to be a bad thing. And sometimes it is the best way to get them to really start talking and sharing. As I was transcribing, when these types of interactions would start, we would start to see a lot more from the student, 3, 4, 5 sentences in a row, which is great. That's what you really want them to do after one particular prompt. But it may have been that the SLP was actually sharing something about their own event related to the initial question. With our narrative samples and doing narrative retells, we still need to keep with open-ended prompts. So tell me about the story. Tell me the story the best that you can. Those are great open-ended prompts. If you use the SALT protocols, they actually have example prompts that you can do that are right there in the instructions. So I encourage you to use those. But sometimes our students are being, and in particular with narrative samples, we're asking them to do something that they may not have ever done before, which is listen to a story and retell it. So they're unfamiliar with the task and don't know what it is that you're really asking them to do. And so you may need to actually do some really quick training on what it is that you mean with this particular type of an activity. So that's something to kind of think about, because that brings us to a dynamic assessment activity that we could do with our students around this communication sample activity. You're going to actually watch a video here in a minute of me doing this with a client that came into a clinic that I was working in. And as we watch the video, you'll notice that the initial story retell that I got from him versus the one that I got after we did a little bit of training is completely different. It's drastically different. And had I written a goal off of his first narrative retell, I would have completely underestimated where we could go from there. Both of them were not age appropriate, but one was drastically different than the other. And so what I was able to do with this dynamic assessment activity is really figure out what his baseline skill level was, and not having the layer of complexity of he just didn't understand the task that I was asking him to do because he had never done anything like that. And so our goal is we never want our task to be the reason why we're seeing what we're seeing, because that means that we're not making an accurate diagnosis. And so a lot of times with some of your clients, you may need to do this. And so I'm going to kind of talk about what that might look like. It's really not that time consuming. So I know time is of the essence for all of us, but this is something you can do in a single setting. When I was going through my grad program, I had to take a bunch of classes over in education. And one of the teaching styles that they really emphasized as a great way to teach, and I use it in my therapy as well as my college classroom, is I model, we do it together, and then you do it. And this is the exact same framework I use when I'm doing a dynamic assessment on teaching my client on how to do a narrative retell. And like I said, I can do all of that pretty quickly, and I try to do that. So at least 20 minutes tops would be what I would estimate I need in order to elicit this and do this dynamic assessment activity. The one that you're going to watch is a little bit long, but I'm actually going to talk to you about some of my fatal flaws that I did in it after we watch it together, because there were some things that I did well and then other things that I did not do well. And so I want to be very specific about that so that you don't make the same mistakes. So for instance, let's say I wanted to do a narrative retell on Frog, Where Are You? Which again, when we get to the database, you'll see that that's one of our options. But I'm concerned that this student is not going to understand what I'm asking them, or, you know, I just don't know that they're going to understand it. I'm going to take one of the different Mercer Mayer stories that go along in that series. So maybe One Frog Too Many, Frog Goes to Dinner, you can choose, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to have them listen with me to the story, and then I'm going to model retelling that story. And then I'm going to turn it over to them and say, now it's your turn. You tell me the story like I just did. And they can flip through the book and tell the story to the best of their ability. And then I would say something to the effect of, okay, now I'm going to have you listen to a different story. And I want you to do just like you did there and retell me that story like we've been practicing. And this will take that element of the story retell out of them being confused as to what they're supposed to do or embarrassed or anything. And they'll feel much more confident in their ability to complete the task successfully. We have to remember these are kids that are not the most confident people in the room. And a lot of that is because their school experiences have not been positive, and they oftentimes do things incorrectly in their eyes. And so they're not big risk takers. And a narrative retell, I need you to be a risk taker, and I need you to at least try. And so doing this type of an activity can help them to break down that barrier. So here is me with him, and I'm going to hopefully be able to play this. Libby, jump in if something goes wrong.
Will do.
A kid was rolling a snowball in the snow, and he was having fun.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys could hear, but in his first story that he just did, he's looking at a single picture. It's a little boy who I think is playing with his dog in the snow. And he basically said it's a boy playing in the snow with his dog and they're having fun. And that was his entire story. Okay.
So before you start again, the question is, should you do the model, then together, then just the student all in the same session?
You'll see this all in the same session. You don't necessarily have to do it that way. you're just going to have to reorient them to, I mean, you guys know this because it's like in therapy when you have to stop in the middle of something. Before you pick it back up the next time, you're just going to want to remind them of what it was that you were doing. When you do it all at once, it makes it a little bit easier because you can not have those reorientations. Does that help?
It does. She said, okay, thanks. And then one more question. Should we make a note of the training when submitting?
No, you don't have to because it doesn't change the database per se. And again, if anything, it helps to make it a little bit more reliable than what we might get otherwise, especially if you're going to have to overprompt. It's worse. So one of two things is going to happen if you have a kid that's not ready to just do the narrative retell. They're just going to look at you and you're not really going to get anything, or you're going to get like 3 utterances like with this kid. I mean, we got a 9-second sample from him just now, and that was all I was going to get out of him. So I have that issue. That's not going to be reliable and valid because it doesn't really show me his true ability. If I overprompt and keep saying anything else, well, tell me about this part of the picture, tell me about this, tell me about that, I'm also not going to get a reliable and valid sample, because now it's more about turning into a conversation back and forth than it is a narrative retell. And the whole pragmatic structure of a narrative retell is that I'm supposed to, as the speaker, take on the communication load. That's the pragmatic rules of that particular genre. So if I'm not able to take on the speaker load, which means I have to know how much I need to tell in order to convey my thoughts and ideas accurately and thoroughly. I have to be able to read my speaker to see if they're confused so that I can go back and provide clarification. I have to have the syntactic and semantic skills to be able to say what I want to say in multiple different ways. Those are all the things that a person who is an effective speaker should be able to do when they're telling a story. If I'm over prompting them, then they're not taking on that load that they're supposed to be able to do in a narrative. They're actually performing more like a conversation.
And on that line, Joe asked, are you allowed to observe the child play, talk with another child?
So you could, I would actually put that under the category of an observation and not a communication sample. And it's not going to align with the database and the way that the samples were gathered in the database. So just like with a standardized test, we're supposed to do the prompts based on how it says on the back of the plate or in the protocol, and we're not supposed to ad lib. If we're going to use the sample to compare to the database to get standardized scores, it's really best practice that we elicit those in the same way that the samples in the database were elicited. Now, if you wanted to write a goal, sorry, Libby, if you wanted to write a goal and I wanted to base it on like their play sample with a peer for maybe a preschooler, using that for progress monitoring is just fine. You just wouldn't necessarily want to do it for a diagnostic activity. Okay, anything else, Libby?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. Okay, so in 9 seconds, we got our 3 or 4 utterances. I have the transcript in a different presentation, but I didn't get it into this one. So we have his 9-second sample that he just did. And then you'll watch what I do next.
Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about what stories have in them. What's your favorite story that you've read? Or you've watched a movie?
I like to circus.
Which one?
Nitro Circus.
Nitro Circus. Okay. So in that, is that a movie? Okay. In that movie, they had characters, right?
Yeah.
And they gave their characters names. What were your characters' names in Nitro Circus?
Travis and what the other names?
Okay, and so if we were going to tell your story again about the little boy rolling his snowball, what kind of a name do you think we could give him?
George.
George. Okay, so that would make our story a little more interesting, right? So we'll name him George, and he's playing out in the snow, and that's where he is, right?
Mhm.
That's his setting. So our good stories tell us where the stories happen. So George was playing in the snow at a park. Do you have any parks in the city that you like to go play at?
The swimming pool.
The swimming pool. Does the swimming pool have a name?
No.
No. Is it the Nest City Pool?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the name. So we could say that he was at the Nest City Park by the pool, right? So George was building a snowman at the Nest City Park in the snow. And all of our stories need to have some kind of a takeoff that happens. And what a takeoff is, it can be something that's a problem, something that's funny, or something that's scary. Do you want his story to have something funny, a problem, or scary happen? Something funny. Okay, so what could be something funny that happens when you're building a snowman in the park?
The snowball rolls into me.
So the snow blew in his face, maybe, right? And how do you think he felt when the snow? He felt cold, and maybe he felt cold and sad, or maybe cold and mad. Which one do you think?
Cold and sad.
Okay, so George is in the Nest City Park building a snowman when snow blew in his face and it made him feel sad and cold. That was what we said. I have to keep saying it or I'm going to forget our story. So what might be something that he plans to do to make himself feel better?
Inside.
Okay. Okay, so George was playing in the Nest City Park when snow blew in his face as he was building a snowman, and he felt sad and cold. So he decided, that's one of those words, because when we decide something, it happens up here. That's why there's bubbles there. So he decided to go home and get warm. Now he's going to have an action. How did he? Yeah. So he ran home as fast as he could down the street. And then our story lands. See, a rocket takes off and then it lands. And so what's he going to do when he gets, how's it end?
Bed.
So he crawled into his bed and got all warm. And then how did he feel?
Good.
And then he felt better because he wasn't cold anymore. Let's tell our whole story again. I'm going to do it first. George was playing in the Nest City Park in the snow, building a snowman. All of a sudden, the snow blew in his face and he felt cold and sad. George decided that he would go home and get warm. So he ran down the street to his house and into the door to his bed and crawled inside. And then he felt all happy because he was nice and warm. And that is the end. Okay, so now you get to have a turn telling the story.
George was playing at the Nest City Park and the snow blew in his summer. All the snow blew in his face. He felt sad and cold. And he decided to go home.
Mm-hmm.
He ran home as fast as he could and went inside the door and crawled into his covers and woke up and he was all better.
Very good. Okay, so this time I'm going to show you a new picture and I want you to make up the story. And what I want you to do is to draw out your parts. So like here we could have drawn, or I'll draw on this one. on here when you were playing.
Okay, I'm going to pause this because I was doing a different task than a lot of you have been doing with the frog books. And I want to kind of talk about the differences. So in this one, I just showed him a single picture of an activity and he was supposed to make a story up about it. And then I modeled the story with the icons. If I was doing this around one of the frog stories, kind of like I mentioned before, I would have listened to the story recording that's available for a different story. I would have retold it, then he would have had a turn to retell it, and then we would have moved to the story that I was actually going to use. So I just want to kind of be clear about some of the differences between this dynamic assessment activity and how it might look, because you're probably not going to use icons when you're practicing doing the frog retells, just because that's going to add another element that might actually make it more difficult, because they have the pictures, sequences in the books that can help them remember the different parts of the story, which is different than this type of a task. I'm going to pause for a second in case there's questions about that.
You don't have questions about that, but you do have another question that
Okay.
Yeah, it's regarding older students. Would you recommend doing language samples for older students, like middle and high school?
Absolutely. And you can do narrative retells as well, or narrative tasks. There's actually an expository task in the database, and we'll look at that and see what's available. But yes, I would definitely encourage that. I would also encourage, if you go, and we'll talk about this later, but there's also the possibility that you move into writing as an assessment activity as opposed to oral, and especially in middle school and high school. When we think about academic relevance, we know that the oral sets the groundwork for your writing and your reading comprehension. There's actually a clinical trial that just was published that solidifies that connection between narratives and reading comprehension. So if anything, our place at this table has taken another leap forward with one of these very recent studies. But definitely I would be doing communication samples with your older students. Okay, I'm going to finish showing parts of this, but I'm going to probably skip some places because he's going to take this sheet and draw on it, and it gets it's a little bit boring to watch because he moves slow.
In this story with these pictures, we could have drawn George, and I'm not as good of an artist, so I would have just kind of done stick figures. So George, and then I could have drawn a picture of the park and the snowball. So you don't have to write any words. We just want to write pictures so we can remember our different parts of the story. So then I could draw wind blowing snow into George's face. Oh, he's probably not happy when the snow blows in his face. What about that?
How would you make the character?
Well, you can draw a picture of the kid. You don't have to draw the dog unless you want to. And then you just need to think about what. Oh, you start whenever you want.
The kid was on these
Barns.
Sure.
I always think of barns when I think of barns.
We're having problems.
Rhymes. Yeah, big doors, because tractors are big. Okay, so he was at the farm, and what's going to happen? Remember, we can have our takeoff be something funny, something scary, or something that's a problem.
And his parents left him.
Oh no, so he's home all alone. How are we going to draw that? Or you can just write a word there. that the house?
Mhm.
Oh yeah, you could draw a picture of him driving away in the car. How's that? Or Bob. Okay. Here's Bob. That's Bob, right?
Mhm.
And that's his parents leaving. I like it. It's a great story. Okay, so now when you tell your story, you can look at your pictures so you can remember everything. Okay, so now you tell me the story of Bob.
Bob was at a farm and his parents left him and he was mad and he was thinking to go to his friends to call his parents and he was running and he got to his friends and called his parents and at the end they picked them up and drove off.
Excellent job. That story was much better than our first one because we remembered to put all.
So if you remember his first story, we had about 3 lines, and it wasn't even really a story with an initiating event and characters. But then when we got to the end and I got that last story, again, it's still not an age appropriate story, but it was a much better reflection of what kind of a narrative he's able to generate on his own. So hopefully this kind of shows you how, and I know dynamic assessment is one of those activities that you can do now with 2419 to kind of look at the pre and the post. So yes, we got improvements between where he started and where he ended, but we have to remember that where he ended is still not where we would expect a child of his age to be that's typically developing. And so that's the benefit of the dynamic assessment, because I try to be as efficient as possible in my evals. And if I'm going to use my data from this narrative to write his goal, because that aligns so nicely with the college and career readiness standards, that I am going to need to make sure that I have good data to base that off of. Any questions before I go to the next slide?
I don't see any.
Okay. Okay, so now we're going to kind of look at the data. I'm going to, I think I go out of the PowerPoint at this point. And we're going to look at the data and see what that would look like, and what you're going to get sent if we're able to use the database, and just kind of walk everybody through that. So this is one of the samples that I recently coded, and I'm going to start with the first transcript page. So this is actually the last page of what you'll get, or the last part is where you get the line by line. Can you see that, Libby?
It's a little hard to see. Can you
I think I can make it bigger.
change the view? And while you're doing that, someone wanted to know, would we also do a sample on non-typical developing kids? Right? That's what she asked.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah. Andrea, do you want to put more in the chat box to explain that? Non-typical developing kids.
So I would assume that the kids that you're evaluating are being referred for some reason. So I would think that they're non-typical. You don't have to create your own database. We have that in the transcription system that we use.
So Andrea said you had said he was a typical developing child in the video.
Yeah, he's not. He was not.
Okay. Did she answer your question, Andrea? Okay, I must have misunderstood, she said. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no, he was not typically developing. He has a DLD diagnosis. Okay, so this is a 6.5-year-old. Is that easier to see, Libby?
It's great. Yes, we're down. We can see through number 8.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so at the first, you're going to see this first line that says child examiner. That's more for the computer system so that it knows how to analyze the information. So you don't need to pay attention to that. These lines that have pluses before them give you contextual information about the samples and or the child. So this child is an English speaker, which is why it says language English. In place of the name, we always do the initials if we're provided them or something. Sometimes it's whatever you named the audio file as. If we're able to determine the gender, sometimes we have that information, sometimes we don't. But this is a male, and you'll notice that the age is in years and months. So if at all possible, if we can have both of those, and you'll get prompted for them, it makes the analysis more accurate if we have years and months, just like with a standardized test. Context is always going to be the type of sample that you've chosen to do with the client. In this case, it says NAR, so it's a narrative. If it was play, it would say play, and that's a play-based sample. If it was conversation, it just says con. And then if you did an expository task, it would have EXP there. For some of the types of context, there's a subgroup. So there's a lot of different options with narratives. And so if we know that you did frog, where are you? We can select that. And that's what this stands for. That's the acronym for frog, where are you? We usually,
Jayne,
yeah.
I'm sorry. We've got some people that are having that have gotten kicked off.
Oh, okay.
And so it says our internet statewide just went out. Well, that's lovely. That's from Jayne. From Leanne. So we're watching. So that's why you've been kicked off, guys. This could be a problem. We may, we'll watch to see what Leanne says. We may just go ahead and do the recording and people could watch it later.
Are you the only one left?
I'm looking here to see. Some are still connected, but they don't know how. And some are on their phone and some are still here. So that's interesting. Several are still there. So let's see. Many are using their phones. Some are still there. So I guess what we'll do is go ahead and proceed. And those of you who got kicked off, if I can contact you, you might want to try to get back on or otherwise watch the recording.
Okay. Can you still see what I see?
Yes, we're at examiner and subgroup, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to pick up there, but Libby, jump in if you need me to do something. So the examiner is usually going to be the speech language pathologist that got the sample is where we put that. And then whoever transcribes it, in this case, it was me. So that's kind of these first lines. There may be more additional plus lines, but these lines are more, like I said, for information than they are for other stuff. And then we start the transcript. A lot of times it will begin with the examiner in this case, and we write out exactly what you say, word for word. And then we go into the transcript. Now you'll notice that lines 15 and 16, the child has said 2 sentences, but they're not related to the story retell, which is why we put parentheses in them, because we don't want them included in the analysis. So the parentheses are there to tell the computer to kick those out, because again, it's not relative to the narrative retell. So then we have the examiner going through again. As you're going through the sample, I'm going to just kind of talk about some of the things that you might see. These codes at the end where it says SI-X. This means SI stands for subordination index. That's another way of saying clausal density. That's a measure of advanced language that looks at the complexity of the sentences that a child uses. Children start using dependent clauses as early as 3 and 4 years of age. We expect them to use them quite a bit by the time they turn 5 or 6. And so this is a number that we'll look at here in a minute that helps us to evaluate that sentence complexity. This one has an X at the end because you'll notice that in the sentence there's an X. That means there was something I couldn't understand. In that case, it gets thrown out of the sample because we only use complete and intelligible utterances in the analysis. So then as you go through, you'll notice that there's going to be words that have slashes in them. This means that that particular word had a grammatical morpheme. Hopefully these are words that are familiar to you. It has a grammatical morpheme. This /s tells the computer program to count that word as 2 morphemes and not 1 when calculating MLU. The same thing here with the contraction your. That slash tells it to count this word as 2 morphemes so that you can get an accurate MLU count. Again, you can see here that we have parentheses around fillers. And then we are going to have what they said. If they make a mistake, like in this case, he did not use the correct word. So we put an error word code into that particular sentence. And if I can figure out what the word should have been, you'll have a colon and what that should be. And then you'll notice here that there's that subordination index code, and this one just has 1 clause in it. And so therefore it's SI-1. The other thing before we move up to your data sheets that I want to point out is that throughout the samples, especially with kids with language disorders, you're going to see words like this that have an asterisk either before the grammatical morpheme or here with and, it's before the entire word. This means that the child omitted it and should have included it. And so this also helps the computer to know that they were obligated to use regular past tense ED, but he omitted it twice in that particular utterance. And so that, again, when we do the data analysis here in a minute, you'll see those errors taken into account. Questions about how to read the transcript?
We have a question from Laura. She said, you said unintelligible utterances are thrown out of the sample. Is it still included for estimated intelligibility that is included in every report?
So yes, that's a different measure. So this seems so big to me. I can't see. So let's go back up here. I'm going to answer your question, but as we're going and looking at this is the sheet that I love the most. And it's the second page of what you will get. We call this the standard measures report, and that's because that's what it's titled. I find this to be one of the most informative pieces of information, but I'm going to talk you through the header first, and then we'll start looking at the table. So again, you'll notice that things get repeated. These reports are meant to be part of a client or a student's permanent file. So they get marked no different than your blood samples that go to the doctor. So anything that I put at the top of that transcript that is relevant, it will get pulled into this header information because we can't have pieces of data running around that aren't identifiable. So we have the child up here. We didn't have the sample date, but we do have the age. And then we have Frog, where are you for our context? This is the information about the database that you have available to you. So this is about the child. Anything that's on this side of the column tells you about the database that he got compared to. So he got compared to the narrative story retail database. There were 73 kids or samples that were 6 months around him. So it pulls in any sample that was given by a kid 6 months younger and 6 months older. in order to create the database means and standard deviations. And then we chose 1.25 as the flagging amount in order to raise concerns over here, but you'll actually have other information. So that's kind of the header stuff. There was an article, oh my gosh, time is not something I remember well anymore. I want to say it was about 2 years ago, there was an article in LSHSS that talked about what size or how many samples you need to be reliable, but they consider anything around 30 based on their analysis should be a reliable and valid number for samples to compare to. Just to give everybody a frame of reference, 73 is actually really good. That would be considered a really large database. So we have our total utterances that we elicited from JC. So he had 37, but 7 of those had something that was unintelligible or he abandoned it. So we actually only had 30 complete and intelligible utterances. So that's that complete and intelligible utterance number that I'm going to be talking about. And then we have this total number of words in the entire sample and what that looks like. To the question that you were asking about percent intelligible utterances, this is where that number up there for total utterances versus complete and intelligible, they calculate that percent intelligibility here. So this is a very gross measure of intelligibility. But if you had a client that didn't have articulation or speech sound disorder concerns, you could use that measure to rule them out for further analysis. Like you wouldn't have to give the Goldman-Fristow if they were intelligible. I had a friend who studied under Dr. Hodson, who invented the cycles approach, and she used to always remind us that the point of communication is not to have perfect articulation, but to be able to be intelligible so that we can share our thoughts and ideas. And so she always thought that this measure was good at ruling out kids that are intelligible but may not have perfect speech. Okay, so measures for syntax and morphology that you may want to pay attention to. We've got MLU in words, just to kind of remind you what that stands for. That's mean length of utterance or average length of utterance. I also sometimes think of it as the average length of the sentence. In this case, it's in words, and you can see that his average sentence length was 5.9 words a sentence. In this case, that was more than 2 standard deviations lower than the database that was 7.48. So what you can see is this number here that's the -202 tells you how many standard deviations someone is above or below the mean, so that then you can see where you may want to target treatment if it's at a level that is significant or meets the state expectations for qualifying for services. Each of these columns over here has a different purpose, and I'm going to kind of walk us through that. The first column is the mean for the database that was pulled together. Then we have the minimum, which is basically 1 standard deviation below that. So the lowest and then the highest, 9.5. And then our standard deviation is 0.78. So actually, it's your minimum and your maximum. So in the database, the lowest score they had was 5.69. The highest score they had for MLU and words was 9.55, but there was a standard deviation of 0.78. So all of this is based on a normative curve when you're looking at these numbers. SALT will automatically highlight gray anything that is more than whatever you tell them is the significance. So remember up here, we said our standard deviation interval that we were interested in was 1.25. If you wanted to set that higher, like 1.5, you could do that.
You already shared whatever that you see.
What was that?
Somebody has their mic on. I'm
Oh,
looking
okay.
for it.
No worries. Okay, so that's kind of how to read this MLU in words. I'm not going to go in as much detail on the next couple of measures if everybody feels like they understand these database columns. Does anyone have questions about these database columns over here? I don't want to beat a dead horse.
I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay. Libby, if you see anything, interrupt me, okay?
Okay. Oops, your mic is turned off. I must have turned you off too. Sorry. Uh-oh. Do you know how to turn your mic back on? I turned off somebody and it must have been you. The mic that's at the top, you just click on it again.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
I can, sorry.
No, you're fine. Okay, so I'm going to go back to make this big because I have a feeling it went small on you. Okay. So then we have MLU and morphemes, which is the next line. This is the same thing as MLU and words. It's just now we're doing morphemes. So all those words that had slashes where they actually included it are now counted as multiple morphemes, which is why it's higher than the MLU and words. So we've got 6.4, but you can see that this child's still more than 2 standard deviations below his peers on his sentence length. We've got percent utterances with verbs. This is an interesting measure that's more recently come out as something that we want to pay attention to because kids with developmental language disorders have a lower semantic class on verbs, and so they tend to use them less often. It's also tied to sentence complexity. I don't want to overwhelm everyone, so I'm not going to go into that right now. The other one that I tend to pay attention to the most is this subordination index. So if you remember, I said that was the average number of clauses used in a sentence. So he's just over 1 clause on average, which isn't quite as far behind his peers as the other 2 measures. But the likelihood is he's only 6.5. That gap is probably going to increase over time if he doesn't have intervention, just because it's a little bit later developing. So he's had, it's still a small gap at this point. When we look at semantics, we have the total number of words in the sample, and you can see here that he was just over 1.25 standard deviations. And then the number of different words, a lot of times that looks at your vocabulary size as far as, you know, how much diversity do you have in your lexicon. And so he's almost 1.5 standard deviations below the mean compared to his peers. As you know, type token ratio has kind of gone away, but we have this new measure that's been proven to be more reliable called the moving average type token ratio. It's really complicated to figure out how they calculate that. I'm still not sure that I understand it, but in this particular case, he's not significantly different from his peers. So that's not necessarily an area of concern right now. Another one that sometimes comes up with kids with language disorders is this maze words as percent of total words. We know that kids with developmental language disorders or language disorders in general sometimes have a hard time organizing their thoughts. And so they may repeat themselves within a sentence, have things that they're inputting that end up getting mazed. Those are those things in parentheses that were in the sample below. So sometimes you will see that this measure is significant because it indicates that they're having a hard time organizing their thoughts in order to convey their ideas. The other measure that is often helpful is this measure on percent utterances with errors. So this clumps together all the different errors, whether that's they used the wrong verb tense, they omitted words, they put words in the wrong order. All of those utterances would be counted as an error. And you can see that this child has almost 65% of his sample is okay, but 35% is a really significant amount of his sample having an error in the utterance. And that was 3 standard deviations below the mean almost. So that would be an area of concern. And then where we can see that the issue is not necessarily error codes. So like he was using the wrong word or the words are in the wrong order. This next measure here tells us that what he's doing is omitting words. So if you remember back to the utterance that had those asterisks in it, he has a significant number of sentences that have omitted words. So we would want to go in and see what that pattern is for the types of words that he's omitting. So this is the main page that you may want to look at. The nice thing about SALT is that when we run the report, we run one where it goes through and actually will help you to interpret the data. So this first page can be really helpful because they break it down and they tell you which things are significantly different from their peers, and then which things are within 1 standard deviation or within the expected range. So 37 utterances using 220 words were both within normal limits for that particular task, and his intelligibility. So I would strongly encourage you, especially when you first start out, to use this first page to help you to understand the following sheets of raw data. I'm just going to kind of scroll through. You'll notice that they have them clumped into the major areas. So we've got intelligibility, syntax and morphology, semantics. Verbal facility is the fancy way of talking about how well you can organize your thoughts and ideas. So this looks at pauses throughout the sample. Filler words, things like that. Because this is an area where we can see some kids struggle. And then they help you to interpret the errors. So this gets written out differently depending on if it's an area of concern with that client or it's not. So this is a report that will change depending on the sample that's submitted and analyzed.
Jayne, there's a question about what if the student stutters?
So there's actually a database for fluency coding that we have access to in SALT. So we would go through and mark that we wanted to use the fluency database, which is a little bit different.
She said, cool.
Yeah, I mean, the flexibility with the SALT system is actually quite amazing because you could even make up your own codes. This is my plug for, instead of buying a standardized test, maybe buy SALT. Because you can create your own codes for a client and you go in and code samples over time to monitor their progress and do analysis just for that one thing, to monitor them over time on a goal. Okay. Now I'm going to go through, so we went through the standard measures report. The thing to remember is that these next couple of sheets that have tables and things, those will change depending on the sample and depending on what was significant or not significant with the client, because there's so many different data analysis that you could do. SALT will automatically pull into this report the ones that are most meaningful for that particular client. So the ones I'm going to show you today may be different than the ones that come back when you get emailed a report. If you ever have questions, you need to email us back. I know in the past, the graduate assistants who have been helping me have had to use their own email, but just today we finally got the university to help us set it up so that the grad assistant can email you from our Salad Lab email, which I will tell you now. It is salad@hsc.wvu.edu. And that email goes straight to the lab. And she will answer you, or she will reach out to me and I will help her answer you. Okay. So this next table is actually very helpful because it can help you to see where you might have weaknesses, strengths, and things. If you remember from that standard measures report, the MLU and words and morphemes were both low significantly, and so it's marked it as a weakness, but these other areas were age appropriate. But then the percentage of utterances with errors, if you remember that one, I think it was almost 3 standard deviations below the mean. So they marked that as a weakness as well. Another one that I don't think people pay enough attention to, because I don't know that we've explained this very well historically. So one of the things that we see with students with disabilities in language is that even if their MLU is okay, sometimes what we see is they have a restricted system. So typical kids may have an average MLU of 4, but you will hear them spontaneously at times have an utterance that is like 15 morphemes, 20 morphemes. And so what we see with kids with disorders is that they don't have that flexibility, and you kind of see that here with this particular client. So the child's mean, or so the number of utterances that they had that were 2 words, 3 words, 4 words, you can see that the vast majority of his are fewer when we start to get up in the higher morphemes. This tells you they have a restricted syntactic system to some extent. If you see a big difference, his isn't as bad as I've seen. I've seen some kids that literally had nothing over to the left. Same thing with morphemes. It's the same thing, just in morphemes. So sometimes I look at this to make sure that the MLU hasn't masked an issue, because maybe the average is okay, but I'm really not seeing the flexibility in the system that we want to see, and like we do with kids that are typically developing.
Jane, I'm just making sure that the address that you said was salad, is that all caps?
Yeah.
And would you repeat it one more time? I've got it in the chat box, but I want to check it.
So it's salad, that part's all caps, and then everything else is lower. At H is in house, S is in Sam, and C is in cat. .wvu.edu.
So if they have questions about even doing the sample before they do it, they would email using this address, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
All right, wonderful. I'm going to put it in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay. So any question, this is pretty much, I could go through all of these, but I feel like I'm going to bore you out of your mind. Does everybody feel okay about these sheets?
I'm not seeing questions. I'm
Okay.
seeing some yeses though.
Okay, good. Okay, so what I'm going to do now then is I'm going to, okay, I'm going to actually go to the website. I'm checking my PowerPoint to see what I say I'm going to do next. Okay, I want to go through a couple of things, and Libby, before I go there, I'm going to actually put these links. So the first link I'm going to give you are some Salad resources. If you could copy this and bookmark it, that would be wonderful. And then the next thing that I'm going to bookmark is, or have you bookmark, is the Salad Lab website. So those are the two links that I'm about to show you and kind of walk you through what is there. Okay. So I noticed Libby had sent me a list of questions that people already had. And so this is a folder that's in a Google Drive that has a couple of resources for you that I think will answer some of those questions. The first is, and I believe you may have access to this already, but this test review summary is a document that we put together. We'll keep adding to it as we find other tests, but this is a summary of the psychometric properties of different standardized tests that you might have related to language primarily, but we could add other things to it too. So that document is there. And then I also wanted to kind of point out, I don't want you to just take me like I'm the Bible. So I put in two articles that are kind of, one is related to language sample analysis. The other one is related to interpretation of your norm reference tests and how to do that based on best practice. We actually need to avoid using terms associated with standardized tests like within normal limits or a severe and mild disorder. And this article explains why we need to avoid those terms. But rather when we go to interpret student performance, the most appropriate way to do that is to say that they performed similar to those with a disorder or without a disorder. And so that all kind of is based on that cut score that we talked about in the test review summary. So I'm not going to talk about that a lot unless you have questions at the end. But I just wanted to show you those resources. But there's two folders here that may be helpful for you. The first folder is what sample do I want to choose? And we have different types of prompts. And then there's a Google Doc that kind of gives you basic information on the age range that sample would be appropriate for, where that sample database was gathered from, and then there's actually hyperlinks in this document to the protocol for how to do that. So if you're kind of questioning, what should I do? My kid's 6 years old. This will help you try and figure out what you could do with them that would allow you to use the database. Also in here, and then these are the prompts that are hyperlinked in that first page, so you can dig through them. I've also put together, because I know sometimes it can be difficult to know how you're going to do this. There are different videos that we've put together on how to do the elicitation for some of these narrative retells. So one is for the narrative samples without words, narrative samples using books with words. In particular, we've got the 3 books that are Pookin's Gets Her Way, Porcupine Named Fluffy, and Dr. DeSoto. You do have to cover up the words in those books because the kids will try to read them and then we defeat the purpose of a narrative retell. So there's instructions on how to do that. And then just basic information on how to record your sample so that you'll get the best sample for analysis. So that folder has some helpful things related to that. And then this detailed test reviews, I had all of the grad students that helped me do those test reviews put their summary sheets in this folder, but that test review summary has the basic information. So if you want more detailed information, you can go into that folder and read the information on those tests.
Jane,
Okay.
there's a question about how quickly could we expect to get a sample transcribed and returned?
So with the increase, it used to be usually within a week, but this year it's looking at like 2 weeks is about the turnaround time to get a sample. So if you can time it. Now, that being said, if you're really in a crunch and you tell us that, I'm going to show you when you go to submit your request, you can put in the comment box that you've got the IEP scheduled or the meeting to go over the test results scheduled on X date, and we'll do our best to try and bump you up if we can. I try not to say that too much because if everybody gets bumped up, then nobody gets bumped up. Okay. So now I'm going to kind of walk through the website. So the other link that I had given you that you hopefully bookmarked takes you straight to our main page for the lab. Hopefully it looks like this. And then you'll see that there's hyperlinks. So I'm going to talk about each of these hyperlinks and then we'll kind of go to them. It's not organized as nicely as I would like, but the rules of the university on what we can and can't put on a web page have kind of taken over. So I apologize if it seems clunky. So our current resources list anything when you go to it that you could check out. So these are tools that are available to you that you could request to have us send to you so that you can use them. And then we include a return label so that you can ship it back to us when you're done. So that's that first link that says resources, and it has all the information. If you decide you want one of those resources, that you then go to this link that says request form. And that takes you to this WUFU document that you fill out and you just tell us which items you want us to send to you. And this is more for us because we just keep this basic information. And then you click submit and we get it and we try to have it to you within a week. So that's the WUFU document for actual materials. Questions about that one?
Not seeing any.
Awesome. So if you want to have a language sample transcribed, you're going to come to this page and you're going to click the link that says form. I'm going to kind of go through the whole paragraph first before I talk, actually click on things. Then there's another link, this next one that says here, this is where you upload your audio file. And then the very last link is where you can go to see what you might want to do for so this is another place in another way that lists your different options. And again, you can see the age ranges. This will go to a video example of how to do that particular one. So all of that information that was available to you is also on this page. And then if you click on the task name, it takes you to the protocol. And these are your step-by-step instructions. So it'll say option 1 is, I'd like to find out how you tell stories. First, I'm going to tell you a story while we follow along in the book. When I've finished telling you the story, it will be your turn to tell the story using the same book. So again, as much as possible, you want to try and stick to the wording that's in the quotes, just like you would with a standardized test, just so that we can be consistent with the database. And then there's just different tips as you go down here about what you can and can't do. Type of a thing. So that's available as well for you to do. And again, the hyperlinks are relisted here. So I'm just going to work from here. So you can complete this form. It's another WUFU document. If you can give us the age of the child in years and months, it makes your data a little more accurate. This information about the type of sample is really helpful. We can sometimes figure it out once we start listening to the audio file, but when we go into SALT to start the file, if we already have that it's a narrative and it's Frog, Where Are You? Or it's Pookins Gets Her Way, or you did the expository task, that just helps us to get everything set up correctly from the beginning. And then we want to make sure that we have the right file with the right person. So if you can give us the name that you've named that file here, then we can just make sure that everything is lined up, and then you hit submit. This is just the information. This is not the audio file. You go to the link that says here, and it should look like this page here. So you're going to put in your email in this top box. You can put a message in here. This might be where you want to tell us that you have an IEP in 2 weeks. So if you can have it by that date, you would appreciate it. And then when you click on browse, you'll go and find the file, no different than if you were uploading any file. See. Can you guys see the search box?
The search box is there, but can't see it very well.
Okay. Well, you're just going to search on your computer to find that file, select it, and then hit open, and then that will attach the file. So this is what that website will look. Once you get all the files attached, so you could attach more than one file to this, send this file, but submit multiple WUFU documents because you have 3 kids that you gathered files for. We would like separate ones on each of those, but then you don't necessarily have to send separate audio files. You can upload multiple ones here. Then you click send this file and it goes to us. Pretty straightforward. Okay. And then I know I said this earlier, but if you can go into your recording settings and set it to MP3, it just saves us time. Okay. Any questions on that process? Was that helpful?
Don't see questions. If you have questions, guys, go ahead and respond. Or if it was helpful, let us know with a yes. Yes, was helpful.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. No questions.
Okay, so I think we've pretty much hit on everything that I had planned. I'm gonna go over one just quick summary. I don't know about you guys, but for me, it can be helpful to kind of think about which measures that were in that summary and where they fall with inform content and use and how that goes. So I kind of created these columns on things you might want to think about using depending on what the concerns are or where you're seeing concerns. Productivity can be just in the total length of the sample. Like, are you just not getting, I always tell my students that if they're not talking at all, our first goal is to get them to say something. And then we can start looking at the quality of what they're saying. So productivity is a really important one that can't be underestimated. So their complete number of complete and intelligible utterances, total number of words. If there's vocabulary concerns, you might want to look at number of total words and number of different words. If morphosyntax is a concern, so they're ungrammatical or their sentences are just really simple, sometimes that can be thought of as repetitive format, like they have the same structure over and over and over again. Then you might look at MLU or percent utterances with errors or subordination index. My computer is possessed. And then we also have just organization. So story grammar elements, those verbal facility measures that we saw, that we talked about briefly, can also be things to think about. So we already kind of looked at it. One of the things that I want to let all of you know, because you may be supervising students that are in our graduate program currently, In the last 2 years, we completely redid the curriculum. And so all of our current students and everyone graduating from here is being trained to do transcription. It's built into their academic courses as well as at least their in-house clinical placements where appropriate. So do know that our expectation is that students will use the knowledge and skills that they get taught in grad school. So it would be no different than you guys, right? I mean, if I teach you to do an oral mech, we would think that you would do an oral mech. And they have the tools, they have the foot pedals, they have SALT, they have access to all of this. So they should be expected to use that training if they're there for an externship or a clinical placement. And then hopefully as they graduate and start to get jobs in the West Virginia schools, they would be transcribing and analyzing their own samples. I can't imagine not wanting to do my own for my caseload, only because it's my kid and I want to know. And usually I'm not going to want to wait 2 weeks to know what it is. Like when I administer a standardized test, I want to know what they scored right away. And so this is kind of that same thing. So we just want to let you know that they do know how to do this or should know how to do this in a reliable way.
So you've answered one question about, will this ever be available for them to do their own independently? And I would be we would hope in your counties, you might, purchase that software like Jayne was talking about. So yes, and that makes sense. The other question was, should they know, or is there a way for them to know about like breaks at WVU? And does that change the timeline?
No. So students are hired over that time. Like I spent my time over break helping them transcribe and get caught up. They were transcribing over break because their pay doesn't stop over break, so they keep working at the same time. So there shouldn't be a pause in those, at least for now. Back to the question that you had asked about, would we have access to the training? I will tell you that I'm not sure that it's going. When I talked with Leanne about this years ago when we were talking about putting this together, because I think it first rolled out, and Libby, you can correct me, was it 2018 or 17 that we first started the lab?
I believe it was 2018.
Yeah.
The beginning. Mm-hmm.
And we had transcription services at that time. They weren't used quite as much as they are now, but the intent was never for it to be something that is permanent. I will be honest with you, it's the only state that I know of where this service is available to the SLPs. So it was really meant to be a bridge while we got everyone up to speed and they thought through how each county or each area might handle doing this type of analysis and stuff. So I think there's a plan that I'm going to be working out to be offering trainings and continuing ed on how to transcribe. As far as the equipment side of things, I don't know what the plan is for that, but those conversations are coming probably sooner rather than later, so that you guys can do this yourself. Yes.
Great. I've posted the verification of attendance for the live presentation. So this is what you guys who are attending right now would use to verify your attendance. There's a place on there to also ask any questions that maybe you thought about it later and you have more questions, and we can make sure we get those to Jayne and get that information to you. And I'm going to share my screen and do the QR code, which, guys, remember the QR code is for the recordings. It's not for this. So you have the link in the chat box. And are you seeing my screen?
I am.
Okay, everybody else? Okay, so just remember that links are for live presentations and the QR codes are for recordings. You have until the 16th at 11:30 p.m. to complete your live survey, but most of you, of course, do it right after you're finished. So make sure, I beg you to use, check your email addresses. So when I start sending out certificates, an incorrect email will just, it goes, it doesn't get returned. I mean, it doesn't go to you, it comes back to me, and then I have to make my own certificate for you. So please, please check your email. And this is the QR code for those who are will be watching the recording. And that deadline is the 30th. I think Leanne had put maybe the 27th or 28th, but I gave you the weekend too. So this is the QR code that people would use to view the recording and get credit for it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get ASHA CEUs because all this happened rather quickly, and it takes a while to get those approvals, but you will get a professional development certificate. And now I'm going to get back and I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jane, but I wanted to make sure that we got this in the recording.
Yeah, because people may be having to run. Are there any questions? And I'm not opposed to questions outside of the topic here. I just may not know the answer right away, but I'll do my best.
And you're seeing the chat box?
Yeah, I am. I don't
see questions. I see lots of thank yous. And we so appreciate this. I mean, this was so helpful, and it's such a great service. And certainly the SALT program does so many wonderful things. Lots of people are saying thank you. But this is your chance, guys. We've got her for 15 more minutes if you want to ask any questions about language or
2419.
2419 as it relates to language. And oh gosh, yeah. How much does modeling affect results, or our TIC testing?
So
we try not to model. Yeah.
That's a really good question, Joe. So I think it depends on the type of modeling that you're doing. If you're doing it line by line, like I've had just a couple of narratives that have come in where it was almost like you were doing a sentence imitation task. Does that make sense? Like they would say something and then the kid would say or try to say that same sentence. I would say that is basically an invalid narrative retell. To model a different story and then ask them to retell a different story, you're asking them to do a different task. You'll notice that when I talked about doing the dynamic assessment with Frog, Where Are You? I wasn't doing the training with Frog, Where Are You? Then I would agree with you, that's going to impact that. But because I was modeling it with a different story that had a different storyline, it's not going to have that same impact. Language is a little bit different than articulation. You are correct. We try not to, like when you're giving the Goldman-Fristow, if at all possible, you're not supposed to model. If you end up doing it, you'll notice that in the prompting sequence, they have you do an interrupting phrase so that it's not a direct imitation, and that's why. With language, because as long as I'm not doing a line-by-line imitation like you might do on the SELF-5 with the sentence recall task, then we put together sentences individually, so it's not going to have the same impact. Hopefully that makes sense.
And there was a question, I'm typing the answer, but it might be quicker to answer, the difference between SALT and SALAD.
Oh, good question. Okay, so SALT is the systematic analysis of language transcripts. That's the computer program we use to analyze the samples. SALAD is just the name of our lab. I always joke and say analysis and treatment of language is like your vegetables. Nobody likes it, but everybody needs it. And so that's why I named the lab what it is.
I love it. I'd never heard that. That's great.
I mean, it has an acronym related. I think it's like the something analysis of language acquisition and disorders or something, but the acronym is SALAD intentionally.
So you have a question from Michelle. Do you see that one?
Yes.
What version? Yes. Mm-hmm.
So we currently have SALT 2020. It's the most recent one. Let me see the rest of the question.
She apparently has it on her computer and wondering if she could use it or if it needs to be
Yeah,
updated.
if you have SALT, you could definitely transcribe and analyze it yourself. The database, I think, gets updated automatically when you go to do it, but I would have to check and see, Michelle.
We have a question from Leanne.
Um,
Would you do another story?
I would probably and like I said with that, I think one is enough. So I would model with one story and then elicit a different story for my narrative retell. I don't know that, again, you're doing a different story. So there's only so much learning that they can do that quickly. Those of us that have done narrative interventions, we wish that they were really that pliable. Really, the only thing that you're going to get in that quick of an activity is eliminating that confusion about the task.
So Joe wanted to know how much is the SALT?
I haven't looked to see how much it is for a practitioner. We have the researcher version, which is the most expensive. So I will get that information. That was actually on my thing to do before I meet with Leanne, is to try and figure out the different options for how we could do it the most economically to get it out to people.
And Tammy, to answer your question, I think those norms have changed, but I will have to make sure and look at the policy, but I believe they have changed a little bit. The TN.
I'll have to look and see what the age range is on the TNL2, and I'm actually going to probably, one of our new faculty members comes from Ron Gillum's lab, so she'll probably know the answer faster than I can even look it up. So I will get that information to you.
Leanne and I are frantically finishing the guidance documents, so you will have a lot more of that information. It's we're both dreaming it and living it, and so Tammy, we apologize. But I believe the resource regarding the phonological processes may be in that resources folder. I can't remember.
Jennifer had asked if she could do the analysis, like do a language sample without SALT. You absolutely could do your own transcription and analysis. If you're wanting to get a standard score, you're going to need to, so I didn't talk about how you can do this, but if a research study has a table in the results section that has means and standard deviations for typical students, doing that particular task. And again, I can't emphasize that enough. If you go into the methods section where they're describing what the task was that the students did, you would need to emulate that as closely as possible to use that data that's in the results table for a mean and standard deviation to see if your student falls in that range. It just depends on what you're wanting to use that task for. And a diagnostic, to be honest, given the way the state's regulations are written, I don't know how you would not need the standard score interpretation on the language sample, because otherwise the language sample doesn't really tell you anything if you can't compare it to peers, if you're using it as a diagnostic tool.
Joe remembers tape recorders.
Yeah, I do too. Funny you brought that up. A lot of times you'll notice on the icons for the computer recorders, it'll show a tape. And I asked the students if they knew what it was, and sadly enough, they did not know why that was there.
No.
So we've all dated ourselves.
Hush. Oh goodness. Yeah, one of the last students I supervised, I brought out this little recorder and she's like, "What is that?"
Yeah, a couple of years ago, Walkmans came back and my son had one. He thought he was the coolest kid.
Oh, of course. Other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording here.
Okay.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Jayne. This was just wonderful. The feedback is certainly that people got the information they needed, and it just helped to see it and, to see a demonstration. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And Libby, I'm going to send you that PowerPoint so that you can share it.